I recently began my third rewatch of one of my favorite shows, Gilmore Girls, and things this time have been different, to say the least. The first couple times I watched it, I absolutely loved Lorelai. I thought she was one of the best features of the show and just could not get enough of her, alongside Kirk, obviously. I thought that Rory simply became a spoiled brat after everything was handed to her for years upon years. However, I now kind of dislike Lorelai, mostly during the first 5 seasons. She interferes with several relationships where she has little to no business being a part of. She intentionally rambles to seem cute, but it just screams immaturity. She plays the victim card, even when she's the one in the wrong, lacks significant communication skills, and I could keep going on, but we'll be here all day. Don't get me wrong, I don't hate Lorelai, and nor do I dislike Laura Graham. In fact, there's a few moments where I actually applaud Lorelai for her actions, and I genuinely feel bad for her, especially in season 6. However, there are several aspects about her that have trickled into Rory's personality and actions that ultimately led to her downfall. Thus, this video will analyze the, in my opinion, most significant ways Lorelai negatively impacted Rory. All throughout Gilmore Girls, Lorelai makes several irrational and impulsive decisions that she really shouldn't have made. She sleeps with Christopher immediately after her engagement with Luke ends, goes on an unplanned road trip with Rory after suddenly calling off her engagement with Max. And don't get me wrong, I always love a good spontaneous trip after going through romantic issues, but she was the one who decided to end the engagement so suddenly after leading him on for such a long time. Saying whatever she wants whenever she wants, quickly blaming anyone else for issues even if her or Rory are at fault, and jumping to conclusions irrationally. I understand to a degree that one of the main aspects of the show that makes it stand out so much is how Lorelai is a mother who is still growing up and that she isn't perfect. However, another significant part of the series is that no character is perfect, and even the ones you root for make terrible decisions at times, and perhaps act impulsively themselves at least once. Except Kirk.
I love your daughter.
I love Kirk. But the point of this is that these huge decisions and all these huge mistakes that the characters make allow the show to be somewhat more realistic than other series. Now, I could be wrong, and this is just from my own experience and experiences I've witnessed from other people, but it shouldn't take this long to notice how making irrational and impulsive decisions can easily lead to several harsh consequences while victimizing yourself, which we'll get more into later, and then still be considered as a likable character. This argument especially holds truth when her impulsive behavior often leads to not only hurting herself, but also hurting others. Continuously going down this path, unfortunately, is one of the main reasons I'm not the biggest fan of her. Granted, there are enough people in Lorelai's life that could and should hold her more accountable for her actions, I will say that. Richard and Emily are usually the two that do this at most, but they often come down on her too harshly rather than a nice medium. Nevertheless, Lorelai is a grown woman and should be responsible enough to make her own decisions and realize the negative consequences and outcomes of her impulsive behavior. Now, this has definitely trickled down into Rory's behavior, as she too also is heavily impulsive and makes lots of irrational decisions throughout the entire show. Hence why I think that Lorelai is one of the main reasons that Rory's downfall was not only present throughout the show, but also such a significant change from her personality in the early seasons. As previously mentioned, Lorelai Gilmore victimizes herself even when she is the one in the wrong. Don't get me wrong, it is understandable to feel bad for yourself to a degree when you really screw up, especially when your actions drastically affect someone or something you really care about. But feeling so bad that you play the victim to everyone who asks is where I draw the line. Lorelai often seems to intentionally leave out details when relaying a situation where she messed up but in her eyes, she's the one who is the victim. One example is after Jess and Rory get into an accident, and immediately villainizes Jess and victimizes herself to Luke, despite the fact that Rory was mostly okay and it was a complete accident. Another example is when she victimizes herself every time when Rory wants to spend more time with Emily and Richard in the first season. Don't get me wrong, they don't always treat Lorelai the best, but she shouldn't victimize herself when all Rory wants to do is get to know her grandparents more and vice versa. Since this type of behavior occurs so often, it is unfortunately no wonder that Rory eventually acts this way as well. One major example is when Rory plays the victim when she slept with Dean while he was still married to Lindsay, and even tried to justify her actions. Or when Rory and Logan stole a boat and she dropped out of Yale and somehow convinced her grandparents that she was the victim in all this mess. Thank God that Jess eventually talked some sense into her.
What are you doing? Living at your grandparents' place? Being in the DAR? No, Yale. Why did you drop out of Yale?
Besides all of Kirk's glorious moments,
I've had 15,000 jobs.
That might be the best scene in the entire show. Of course, Rory does hold a good majority of the responsibility when she wrongfully victimizes herself. Nobody told her to sleep with Dean, steal a boat, or temporarily drop out of Yale, or any other mistakes she makes that she also plays the victim of. However, she may not have done so often if she didn't watch Lorelai behaving this way all her life. One of the most prominent issues throughout Rory's downfall is how poorly she handles all of her romantic relationships. Some of the worst examples include when she sleeps with Dean while he's still married to Lindsay, and sleeping with Logan while he's engaged. Not to mention how often she at least emotionally cheats on all of her boyfriends. Granted, no relationship is ever perfect, but cheating this often is a significant problem. And where she could have possibly got that from? Lorelai. Throughout the series, Lorelai kisses Christopher while knowing he's with Sherry. She calls Christopher during her bachelorette party for her engagement to Max because she's more romantically attached to him than her own fiancé, and she kissed Max while dating Alex. Why do Billy Burke's characters always get treated so badly all the time, by the way? Anyways, and of course, Rory knows all about all of this because she's Lorelai's quote-unquote best friend. She knows all about Lorelai's infidelity, and even though she criticizes it at times, she still actively knows that her mother often cheats, or at least emotionally cheats, on her boyfriends and fiancés. Given that Lorelai has such a significant influence on Rory, she is susceptible to mirroring all these actions. Hence, she ends up cheating on most of her boyfriends throughout the series. Of course, Lorelai isn't entirely responsible, and Rory is the one who chose to cheat. However, she might not have cheated, or at least as often, if her mother didn't either. Now, even if Lorelai never cheated on any of her significant others, she still had a huge miscommunication problem with most of her partners. Whether it was secretly seeing an ex while being with another guy, or not communicating how she actually feels, she unfortunately had a terrible habit of getting into messy situations just because she won't communicate, which is pretty ironic considering that she likes to overly talk when it's a bit inappropriate and then act like the victim whenever somebody else calls her out on it, despite the fact how often she is called out on her behavior like this. Fortunately, Rory doesn't really ramble like this when it's inappropriate. It's only when she's nervous or having a mental breakdown.
I'm gonna have to quit drinking coffee. And I love coffee. Oh.
However, she does miscommunicate with all her boyfriends at some point or another. Whether it's hanging out with Jess while being with Dean, or vice versa, or hanging out with Logan while with Dean, or with Jess with Logan, or the whole kiss with Tristan that he hints at to Dean but is never actually told what happened, and so on. If Rory had perhaps a more positive influence on the importance of proper communication while within romantic relationships, all these situations may not have happened. They could have, but the likelihood would have decreased. Don't get me wrong, I think Dean, Tristan, and Jess, and Logan, but probably not as much Paul, poor Paul, all brought something to the table for her character development. Whether that something was good or bad is up to your own interpretation. But I don't think she would have gone through as many relationships or situationship regarding Tristan if she never cheated or communicated better, aka if she didn't follow in her mother's footsteps. I think that one of the main points by the end of Gilmore Girls is that Rory is following in her mother's footsteps despite their different paths in life. I mean, take a look at the revival A Year in the Life. The final scene ultimately establishes that she is going to have a very similar life to her mother's from now on. She's pregnant with Logan's kid, most likely at least, and while he definitely has feelings for her, he is ultimately choosing another woman in the end. Granted, she could have said yes to his proposal at the end of season 7, but she didn't. But essentially, he is to Rory as Christopher is to Lorelai. He's gonna always be there by being the father of her child, and she could have married him when she was younger, but didn't. Yet, he's not quite the one. Then there's Jess. Based on the revival season, he is to Rory as Luke is to Lorelai. He's always going to be there, longing for her as long as they're in each other's lives. And he's always going to push her to be the best version of herself. Luke did just that for Lorelai. So with these relationship dynamics playing out the same way for these Gilmore girls, it is no wonder that they also share the same flaws. Although Lorelai and Rory do irk me quite a bit, I still like them in a sense that they remind me of this show and just why I like to rewatch it every autumn. Sometimes I also think that the problems I do have with this show isn't really about the characters themselves, but more of the writers seemingly not wanting to develop them in a positive direction. There is certainly some positive character development after some of the mistakes that these women make, but not enough to make me like them as much in the earlier seasons of the show, primarily because they just keep messing up over and over again and even repeating some of their mistakes. Nevertheless, I'd like to think that if the Gilmore Girls universe ever continues, Rory would have published her book, she's raising her child the best she can, and her and Jess fall in love again so they can continue bringing out the best in each other. So I'm going to be sharing a Bible verse to fully conclude this video. I like to bring God into everything that I do just because of how devout I'm trying to be, at least. And I'm just wanting to share a verse that I think really connects to Gilmore Girls because it's all about love, and to me this show ultimately is just about love, whether it's platonic, familiar, romantic, albeit very problematic romantic relationships. But I just want to really emphasize how much I love this show and how much love I see within the show. So here's 1 Corinthians chapter 13 verses 4 through 8. Love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast. It is not proud, it does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. God bless you, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day or evening. Goodbye now.